The ice groaned beneath the station like a restless beast awakening from centuries of slumber. The dim glow of artificial lights barely held the encroaching darkness at bay, casting jagged shadows across the frosted walls of the alien research base. Frost clawed at the windows as wind howled, carrying the relentless song of the frozen wilderness beyond. Inside, the air buzzed with a static tension, thick enough to taste. "Commander Thran, sir, there's something approaching," stammered Officer Lether, his usually steady tone cracking like brittle ice. His three eyes flicked between glowing displays as his four-fingered hands danced over controls. The translucent scales on his temples shifted from a calm teal to an agitated crimson. Kale Thran, standing by the central console, did not move immediately. His towering silhouette was as rigid as the glacier beneath their feet. He was a figure forged by countless campaigns, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed carved from granite. His amber eyes were steady, calculating as they scanned the young officer. "How far?" he asked, his voice sharp as the biting wind outside. 15 kilometers and closing. Its size, sir, it's massive." Kale stepped forward, his boots striking the metal floor with purpose, the sound echoing like muted gunfire in the confined control room. He loomed over the holographic display that flickered to life, projecting an image of the unknown vessel. Its angular silhouette cut through the screen like a blade poised for execution. The room seemed to grow colder as the crew gathered around the console. There was a heaviness to their silence, each member wrestling with their own unspoken fears. "Analysis," Kyle commanded, his tone a steel anchor in the storm of uncertainty. "It's unlike anything we've documented," Lether replied, his words strained. "A hull this thick. It's engineered to withstand catastrophic impacts. Energy output is off the charts. Sir, if this thing's a warship, it's not an if." Kale's gaze narrowed. "This is human engineering. They don't come here without reason." Behind him, Senior Analyst Dorn let out a low whistle, breaking the silence. His pale, gaunt frame seemed at odds with his booming confidence. "The humans said this sector was neutral. No installations, no military activity. What's their game?" Kale's jaw tightened. The humans' assurances felt as thin as the air up here. He traced the vessel's design with his eyes, the aggressive angles, the bow shaped like a predator's maw. The vessel was a titan of efficiency, a harbinger of destruction. But it didn't move like a predator. Its path was deliberate, methodical. "Can we hail it?" Kale asked, already knowing the answer. "We've tried," Lether said, avoiding his commander's gaze. "No response." The howling wind outside seemed to surge in agreement, a bone-deep vibration rattling the base's frame. The frost-coated walls trembled. Kyle straightened. "Prepare the station for lockdown. Reinforce all external shields. And someone get me a detailed analysis of that energy signature. I want to know what we're dealing with." "Yes, Commander," the crew echoed in unison, their voices hurried and clipped. They scattered like sparks from a fire, each one diving into their assigned tasks. Kale remained by the console, his mind turning over the possibilities like a blade honing against stone. He could almost hear the vessel's approach in his thoughts, an oppressive inevitability that weighed heavy on his shoulders. What could the humans want here, on a planet as desolate and unyielding as Zetherian? The chill in the room seeped deeper into his skin as he watched the display. The vessel grew larger, the details sharpening with every passing second. The bow gleamed with a metallic sheen, speckled with frost and ice, yet unmarred by the hostile terrain it carved through. The sight gnawed at him, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. A subtle sound drew his attention, a rhythmic tapping. Kyle turned to see Dorn leaning casually against a console, his talon-like fingers drumming an uneven beat on the metal surface. His pale skin glowed faintly under the console lights, casting him in an almost spectral hue. "You've seen a lot, Dorn," Kale said. "What do you make of this?" The analyst shrugged, his thin lips twisting into a half-smile. "Could be a show of force. Could be a message. Humans like their theatrics. Remember the orbital demonstration over Karath Prime? Sent half their fleet just to say hello." Kyle nodded grimly, He remembered the devastation that hello had left behind. But this, Dorn continued, gesturing toward the display, this feels different. It's not rushing us. It's not broadcasting demands. It's just coming. Cale didn't respond. He didn't need to. The weight of the unknown was etched across his face. "Commander," Lether called out, his voice steadier now. "The energy signature, it's not weaponized. At least, not in the traditional sense. No plasma cannons, no rail systems, no thermionic disruptors." "No," Kyle muttered. "Just raw power. Enough to split the planet in two if it wanted." Before anyone could reply, the station trembled again, this time more violently. Frost cracked along the walls, falling like shattered glass onto the floor. Lights flickered as a low groan rippled through the ice beneath them. "Status?" Kyle barked. "Seismic activity, sir," Lether replied. "The ice shelf. It's destabilizing." Kyle's mind raced. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. Was the vessel's presence affecting the planet itself? Or was this the first move in an elaborate attack? "Double-check the stabilizers," he ordered, "and keep monitoring that vessel." Dorn's voice cut through the tension. "You think it's here for the ice?" Cale didn't answer immediately. The idea seemed absurd, but the humans were nothing if not unpredictable. He stared at the projection, the vessel looming ever closer, and felt a deep unease settle in his chest. The vessel wasn't just coming. It was bearing down on them with a purpose they couldn't yet fathom. "Commander, we're within 10 kilometers," Lether reported. "It's starting to break the outer ice." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Kyle turned back to the display, his jaw clenched. "Then we meet it head-on," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "All systems at the ready. If this is the humans' idea of a message, let's make sure they get one in return." The control room erupted into a flurry of motion as the crew scrambled to execute his orders. Kyle stood rooted in place, his eyes locked on the advancing vessel. The frost-bitten winds outside screamed against the station, a primal warning carried on the breath of the planet itself. And yet, the vessel continued, unstoppable, silent, and unrelenting. The icebreaker advanced with a predator's inevitability, its angular hull slicing through the frozen expanse like the edge of a blade carving into flesh. Frost and shards of brittle ice erupted in its wake, glinting momentarily in the weak light before disappearing into the churning void of the planet's frozen surface. The walls of the research station shuddered again, each vibration an unspoken warning. Kyle Thran stood at the observation deck now, the console room below him buzzing with frantic energy. He had positioned himself deliberately, away from the cacophony of scrambling officers and overlapping reports. He needed clarity, space to process the enormity of the thing bearing down on them. Through the reinforced glass, the vessel loomed larger with every passing moment, an unyielding harbinger. The air inside the station had grown stifling, weighted with anxiety. Thran's nostrils flared, catching the faint metallic tang of exposed wiring from the control panels below, a byproduct of overclocked systems. The faint warmth of the room was a sharp contrast to the desolate frigidity outside, where gusts of snow-laden wind raged as if desperate to warn them of what was coming. "Commander," Lether called from below, his voice tight but audible over the controlled chaos. "It's crossed the 5-kilometer mark. Velocity steady, 13 knots. No deviations." Thran's amber eyes remained locked on the approaching vessel. 13 knots, he repeated under his breath, the words tasting foreign. It was almost a taunt, slow enough to provoke unease, fast enough to promise devastation. Dorn appeared beside him, his thin frame draped in the shadow of Thran's broader figure. The analyst's pale skin reflected the faint glow of their tactical overlays, making him seem ghost-like. He leaned against the railing with a casualness Thran didn't share. "Doesn't feel like a warship, does it?" Dorn said quietly, his words barely audible over the rhythmic clicking of consoles below. His tone held a note of curiosity rather than fear, though the slight twitch in his fingers betrayed his unease. Too deliberate. Too cold. "Warships don't have to feel like anything," Thran replied. His voice was low, steady, but edged with the weight of his growing suspicion. They kill. Whether it's loud or quiet doesn't matter. Below them, an alarm shrieked, sudden and jarring. The station trembled, and the air was filled with a sharp hiss as the automated systems worked to stabilize the internal pressure. Thran's gaze snapped to Lether, who was already calling out. "Pressure fluctuations detected beneath the ice sheet," Lether reported, his scaled hands darting across the controls. "Readings suggest displacement waves. Massive ones." "The vessel's engines?" Thran asked sharply, turning to descend the steps back into the control room. "No," Lether replied, swallowing hard. "The ice is reacting to its passage, sir. It's not just cutting through, it's compressing the terrain ahead of it. The shelf is reshaping itself." "Impossible," Dorn muttered, joining them. He bent over Lether's console, his pale fingers tracing data streams. "That would require immense pressure dispersion. No ship of that size could—" He stopped mid-sentence, his face tightening. "Unless it's designed to," Thran finished grimly. The implications hung in the air like a specter. If the humans had built a vessel capable of not just navigating hostile environments, but bending them to its will, they were far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. "Any response from the humans?" Thran asked, turning his sharp gaze to a comms officer at the far side of the room. The officer shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Still nothing. Signals strong on their end, but they're ignoring us." "They're not ignoring us," Dorn interjected. His tone was almost conversational, but the intensity in his eyes betrayed him. "They're measuring us, seeing how we react." The room fell silent at that, save for the ever-present crackle of data feeds and the occasional groan of the station's structure as the icebreaker drew closer. Thran clenched his fists, his mind racing through scenarios. Every instinct screamed to strike first, to obliterate the vessel before it came within range of their fragile outpost. But his training held him back. Striking blind was a mistake the humans would expect. "Send another hail," Thran ordered, his voice cutting through the silence. "This time, open the frequency to universal code. If they don't respond, they've slowed." Lether interrupted, his eyes wide as he stared at the readings. 3 kilometers out, and they've reduced speed to 5 knots. Dorn let out a low whistle. "Well, that's new. Maybe they don't want to spook us." "They're succeeding brilliantly," Thran muttered under his breath. He moved to the central console, his presence commanding the room's attention. "I want all units prepped for engagement. If this is a feint, we won't be caught unprepared." The vessel's massive silhouette filled the observation screens now, a monolith of alien engineering. Its hull, coated in frost and shadows, seemed to drink in the sparse light, giving it an almost predatory aura. The bow's jagged protrusion glinted, each icy fragment cascading from its surface like falling stars. "Sir," Lether said again, his voice softer this time. "It's transmitting." The room collectively held its breath as Lether patched the signal through. The speakers crackled with faint distortion, and then a voice emerged, calm, measured, and unmistakably human. "This is Captain Marcus Blackwood of the United States Coast Guard cutter Polar Star. We mean no harm. Please respond." The words hung in the air like a cold gust cutting through the warmth of expectation. For a moment no one spoke, the stillness punctuated only by the occasional hiss of pressurized systems. "Coast Guard," Dorn said at last, his voice tinged with disbelief. "They're claiming to be a rescue vessel." "They're lying," Thran replied immediately. He leaned closer to the console, his amber eyes narrowing. "The design, the energy output, the lack of response until now, it all points to something else." "What if it's not a lie?" Dorn asked, his gaze flicking to the commander. "What if this really is some earthbound operation?" "Then they'll understand why I'm cautious," Thran said, his tone cold and unwavering. "Lether, keep the shields at maximum and ready all weapon systems. If they breach the final kilometer, we fire." "Yes, sir," Lether replied, though his movements betrayed hesitation. "Do you really think they'd risk their lives to break through ice for us?" Dorn pressed, his voice quieter but no less firm. Thran didn't answer immediately. He stared at the advancing vessel, its steady march unbroken by the gale-force winds battering it. It wasn't just a ship, it was a force of nature, a deliberate creation that defied logic, and that terrified him more than any weapon ever could. "They've risked more for less," he said finally, his words laden with a grim certainty. "And if they're lying, they'll regret underestimating me." The observation screens flickered as the vessel slowed further, now less than 2 kilometers from the station. The weight of its presence bore down on the crew, each member bracing for the inevitable clash. Thran's voice cut through the tension one last time, sharp and commanding. "Hold your positions. Let's see what game they're playing." The air in the command center thickened, oppressive and sharp, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension of the crew. Every monitor pulsed with data streams, their glow casting eerie shadows on the faces of the station's officers. Outside, the icebreaker loomed larger, its deliberate pace evoking the unease of an ancient leviathan closing in on its prey. The silence between transmissions from the ship had become a specter haunting every officer's mind, their imaginations crafting sinister possibilities in the absence of answers. Cale Thran stood by the main display, his broad frame silhouetted against the pulsating holograms. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, dissected every detail of the vessel's movements. "What are you saying?" Thran demanded. "I'm saying," Dorn replied, his tone measured, "this isn't a prelude to war. It's reconnaissance, but not for attack." Thran's gaze hardened. "Until I know otherwise, we assume the worst." Before Dorn could argue, a crackling sound filled the control room, emanating from the comms panel. Lether froze, his fingers hovering above the controls. "They're transmitting again," Lether said, barely above a whisper. "Put it through," Thran ordered, his voice unyielding. The speakers hissed, then stabilized. The same calm, measured voice from earlier filled the room. "This is Captain Marcus Blackwood of the United States Coast Guard cutter Polar Star. We are here on a humanitarian mission. Please cease your reconnaissance activities and respond." The message ended, leaving the room in stunned silence. Dorn broke it first, letting out a low, incredulous laugh. "Humanitarian? That's rich." "They know we're watching," Thran said, his tone sharp. "They want us to think they're harmless." "Do you believe them?" Dorn asked, his pale brow arching. Thran didn't answer immediately. He turned his attention back to the main display, where the 6 drones continued their methodical scans. Something about their precision, their unhurried movements, gnawed at him. It wasn't the behavior of an enemy preparing to strike, but if not that, then what? "Keep the shields up," he said at last, "and prepare to capture one of those drones. I want answers, on our terms." As the crew moved to carry out his orders, Thran stood motionless, his mind torn between doubt and certainty. Outside, the icebreaker remained anchored, its massive form an unspoken challenge. Whatever the humans' true intentions, one thing was clear: the storm was far from over. The captured drone rested in the station's decontamination bay, a metallic carcass bristling with sleek appendages and glowing nodes. Its surface pulsed faintly, casting an eerie blue light onto the frost-laden floor. Cale Thran stood at the edge of the room, his imposing frame still as he watched the station's technicians work. The quiet hum of instruments melded with the faint groaning of the ice outside, a symphony of unease that prickled at the edges of his patience. "It's not hostile," Dorn said, leaning lazily against the observation window. His tone carried a lilt of amusement, though his pale face betrayed the sharpness of his thoughts. "Not unless its purpose is to lull us into boredom." Kyle's jaw tightened. "Purpose doesn't always come with a flag and anthem, Dorn. Sometimes it's buried where you don't expect it." One of the technicians, a wiry officer named Jalen, turned from the drone, his gloved hands streaked with residue from the device. "Commander, its systems are strange. It's packed with sensors and mapping equipment, but no offensive or defensive capabilities. It's designed for precision, not combat." Cale stepped closer, his boots crunching faintly on the frost-dusted floor. The drone's faint glow reflected off his stern features, sharpening the lines of his face. "No offensive capabilities," he echoed. "So why does it feel like a threat?" Jalen hesitated, his gaze flicking between the drone and his commander. Because it's too perfect, sir. Its design, its purpose. It's seamless. It's like it's built to make us underestimate it. Or, Dorn interjected, it's exactly what it claims to be. A glorified ice scout. Kyle ignored him, his focus narrowing on the drone's exposed circuitry. Thin tendrils of frost had begun creeping along its edges, a reminder of the station's relentless cold. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing one of the glowing nodes. A faint vibration buzzed through his palm, faintly warm, alive. "Commander," Jalen began cautiously, "I recommend against interfacing directly. Its systems are already compromised," Kale cut in, his tone measured but firm. "We've pulled it from their network. If this thing has secrets, we'll find them." Before Jalen could reply, a sharp alert pierced the air. The room's lights dimmed momentarily, replaced by the crimson flash of emergency beacons. Thran's comm device crackled to life. "Commander," Lether's voice came through, taut and urgent. "The icebreaker, it's moving." Kyle's chest tightened. "How far?" "Less than a kilometer now. It's circling us." The words hung in the air like a guillotine suspended by a fraying thread. Kyle turned sharply, his long strides carrying him out of the bay. Dorn followed at a measured pace, his footsteps light but purposeful. "Circling," Dorn muttered as they ascended toward the control room. "Like a predator sizing up its prey. Fitting." "Or ensuring we can't escape," Kale replied, his voice clipped. "What's the status of our defenses?" "Fully operational," Lether reported as the two entered the control room. The air was electric with tension, the crew's movements precise and deliberate. Shields holding at maximum capacity. Weapons primed. "Good." Kale approached the main console, his gaze locking onto the vessel's projection. It had moved closer, its vast shadow stretching over the ice like a storm cloud. Its drones had returned, weaving in tight patterns around the station's perimeter, their glowing forms casting fleeting shapes on the frozen surface. "They're watching us," Dorn said, leaning over the console. "Carefully, methodically. It's almost surgical." Kale didn't respond immediately. He studied the vessel's trajectory, his mind parsing through possibilities like a machine built for war. The humans had played their hand, or so it seemed. A humanitarian mission, a search for cooperation. The words tasted hollow now, burned away by the vessel's relentless approach. "They've left us no choice," Kyle said finally. "Lether, prepare the strike team. We're going to board that ship." The room fell silent. Even Dorn straightened, his pale eyes widening slightly. "Board it?" he repeated, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. "Commander, if you're wrong about their intentions—" "Then we'll find out firsthand," Kale interrupted, his tone cutting like ice. "I'm not waiting for them to decide the terms of this encounter." Lether hesitated. "Sir, with the ice conditions, we've faced worse," Kale snapped. "Get it done." Within minutes, the strike team assembled in the station's lower hangar. The air was cold enough to sting exposed skin, the frost-coated walls reflecting the harsh glow of the overhead lights. Kale stood at the head of the group, his combat gear a stark contrast to the sleek, sterile environment. "This isn't a battle," he began, his voice firm but steady. "Not yet. We're going to gather intelligence, assess the threat, and ensure this vessel doesn't leave here with the upper hand. Understood?" The team nodded in unison, their movements sharp and disciplined. Each soldier carried a compact plasma rifle, their visors glowing faintly with tactical overlays. They were ghosts against the ice. Their presence felt more than seen. The shuttle ride was brief, but every second stretched like hours. The vessel loomed larger with each passing moment, its jagged hull gleaming with frost and shadows. Kyle felt the weight of it pressing against his chest, a silent challenge wrapped in steel and ice. "Approaching docking bay," the pilot called out, his voice crackling over the comms. "Minimal resistance detected, no active defenses." Kale's jaw tightened. "Keep the shuttle in position. If we're not back in 20 minutes—" "You'll be back," Dorn interrupted, his voice wry. "You're too stubborn to die here." Kale didn't reply, His focus was already on the docking bay as the shuttle descended. The moment it touched down, the strike team moved with practiced precision, their boots striking the metal floor in unison. The air inside the vessel was startlingly warm, a humid contrast to the biting cold outside. The faint sound of machinery filled the space, a rhythmic pulse that thrummed through the walls like a heartbeat. "Stay sharp," Kyle ordered, his voice low but firm. "Dorn, take point." The analyst moved ahead, his pale frame blending into the muted tones of the corridor. The team advanced in silence, their weapons raised and their senses on high alert. The air smelled faintly metallic, a clean, sterile scent that hinted at the ship's advanced systems. The first signs of life came unexpectedly. A single human figure stood at the far end of the corridor, his back turned to the group. He wore a dark uniform adorned with patches, his posture relaxed yet alert. "Identify yourself," Kyle called out, his rifle trained on the figure. The man turned slowly, his face calm and unyielding. He spoke, his words deliberate and measured. "I'm Captain Marcus Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying no trace of fear. "Welcome aboard the Polar Star." Cale Thran kept his rifle trained on Captain Marcus Blackwood, the weapon's faint energy glow casting thin shadows on the polished walls of the corridor. The human captain didn't flinch. His steady gaze was unnerving, the confidence behind it thick enough to stoke every instinct Thran had honed across years of battle. Around them, the silence of the ship stretched, vast and unnatural, broken only by the muted thrum of its systems coursing through the metal floor. "Stand down," Blackwood said evenly, his words deliberate and calm. He held his hands open, fingers spread in a calculated display of non-aggression. "If we wanted to harm you, Commander Thran, you wouldn't have made it through our airlock." Thran's grip on the rifle tightened, but he didn't lower it. "You're a long way from Earth, Captain. Care to explain why your ship is circling my station?" "Already did," Blackwood replied, his tone clipped but professional. "Humanitarian mission. Icebreakers aren't built for war, Commander. They're built for survival. Yours, in this case." Thran's jaw tensed, his gaze narrowing. "And I'm supposed to believe that? After you send drones to scan my station, destabilize the ice beneath us, and refuse to respond until now?" Blackwood's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, more a flicker of acknowledgement. "Fair points. But you didn't exactly roll out a welcome mat, did you?" Dorn, standing slightly behind Thran, finally broke his silence. "You're unusually confident for someone with 5 plasma rifles pointed at his chest." Blackwood's eyes flicked to Dorn, his expression unreadable. "Confidence or trust? Maybe both." "That's a dangerous gamble," Dorn replied. "No gamble," Blackwood said. His voice softened, but his words carried weight. "We're here because your station is sitting on the edge of a catastrophe. That ice shelf you're so fond of, it's about to break apart, and when it does, you're going down with it." Thran's heart slammed once against his ribs, though his face betrayed nothing. "Convenient excuse. You expect me to believe this is a rescue?" "No," Blackwood admitted, "but you'll believe the data." The captain gestured toward the corridor behind him. Thran's team bristled, their rifles rising, but Blackwood didn't react. "My bridge is this way. You'll see the seismic activity for yourself. Call it proof or evidence if you're planning a trial after this." Thran hesitated, his mind cycling through contingencies. A trap was too obvious, too clumsy, and Blackwood didn't carry himself like a man desperate for control. There was an edge to him, yes, but it felt rooted in confidence, not deception. "Dorn," Thran said, his voice low and measured, "stay close." The team followed Blackwood through the corridor, their boots clicking softly against the floor. The air grew warmer, tinged with the faint metallic taste of circulating oxygen. The ship's design was alien in its familiarity, a seamless blend of advanced technology and utilitarian function. Thran's eyes scanned every detail, the reinforced bulkheads, the perfectly spaced vents, the faint vibrations that hinted at immense power surging just beneath the surface. The bridge was vast, a cathedral of light and motion. Displays lined the curved walls, projecting shimmering holograms of the surrounding terrain. At the center, A large table-like console pulsed with data, its surface reflecting the urgency of the situation. Blackwood moved to the console with practiced ease, gesturing for Thran to approach. "Here," the captain said, bringing up a detailed map of the ice shelf. "These cracks," he pointed to the glowing red lines snaking through the projection, "have been accelerating over the past 72 hours. The pressure buildup beneath the surface is reaching critical levels. When the shelf calves, it'll take your station with it." Thran studied the map, his expression carved from stone. The fractures were undeniable, the data chillingly precise. He looked up, locking eyes with Blackwood. "If this is true, why not warn us earlier? Why the delay?" "We tried," Blackwood replied simply. "Your communication system isn't exactly compatible with ours. And we weren't going to risk triggering a defensive response by getting too close without context." "Then why now?" Dorn asked, stepping beside Thran. "Why push so hard at this exact moment?" Blackwood's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "Because it's happening faster than we predicted. You've got hours, maybe less." The weight of the statement pressed on the room like a descending glacier. Thran felt it settle in his chest, heavy and undeniable. His instincts screamed at him to question, to challenge, but the evidence loomed too large to ignore. "And your role in this?" Thran asked, his voice hard but quieter now. "What does an icebreaker have to offer us?" Blackwood straightened, his shoulders squaring as he spoke. "Evacuation if you're willing. We clear a path through the ice, get your people and your research to safety. But I need your cooperation. We can't do this alone." Thran's team exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of skepticism and apprehension. Dorn leaned closer to Thran, his voice a low murmur. "If they wanted us dead, they'd have done it already. Maybe they're telling the truth." "Or they're hiding something," Thran replied under his breath. "Of course we are," Blackwood said, as if hearing the exchange. His tone carried no malice, only blunt honesty. "Every species hides things. But this isn't about secrets, Commander. It's about survival." Thran stepped back, his rifle lowering slightly. He studied Blackwood for a long moment, the weight of his decision etched into every line of his face. Finally, he spoke. "If you're lying," he said quietly, "there won't be enough ice left on this planet to bury you." Blackwood gave a single nod, the faintest flicker of relief crossing his features. "Fair enough. Let's get to work." The next moments passed in a blur of motion and urgency. Thran's team relayed instructions to the station, their voices tight with urgency as they prepared for the impossible task ahead. The bridge hummed with activity, human crew members moving with practiced precision as they coordinated the icebreaker's next moves. Through it all, Thran couldn't shake the unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. The vessel, the timing, the too perfect explanations, it all felt orchestrated, deliberate. But for now, survival outweighed suspicion. "Commander," Dorn said, his voice cutting through the noise, "we're out of time. The shelf's destabilizing." Thran turned to Blackwood, his amber eyes fierce. "Then let's see what your ship can do." The vessel surged forward, its reinforced bow carving through the fractured ice like a predator through a weakened herd. The shuddering of the surrounding ice shelf reverberated through the station as distant cracks echoed like cannon fire. Kyle Thran stood rigid on the bridge of the Polar Star, the alien commander's shoulders squared against the encroaching chaos. Around him, human crew members moved with an urgency that was practiced, not panicked, calculated precision in the face of mounting disaster. The screens around the bridge glowed with projections of seismic activity. Red fractures lit up the map, creeping toward the station's coordinates in jagged lines that mirrored lightning across a stormy sky. Data feeds scrolled faster than the eye could track, their sharp beeps punctuating the tension in the air. Thran's gaze didn't waver from the map. "How long before the first section of the shelf collapses?" Blackwood, standing at the central console, didn't pause as he input commands. "Minutes, if we're lucky." Thran's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding against the weight of that word, if. Luck wasn't a strategy, and relying on it felt like playing a game where the humans held a deck he couldn't see. "The station isn't fully evacuated," Dorn said, his voice unusually clipped as he stepped forward. We need more time to get the personnel and research off the ice. Blackwood's hand stilled briefly over the console. He didn't look up as he replied, his tone steady but firm. Time's not on your side. That ice is about to shatter, and when it does, it's taking everything with it. Then stop talking and do something, Thran snapped, his voice cutting through the bridge like a whip. He turned to Blackwood, his amber eyes blazing. You said your ship could handle this. Prove it. The captain met his gaze, his expression impassive but not dismissive. We already are. As if on cue, a low vibration resonated through the vessel, a soundless pressure that seemed to hum beneath the skin. The polar star shifted, its hull groaning faintly as it adjusted to the changing terrain. Outside, the fractured ice groaned in response, splintering under the weight of forces it could no longer resist. Deploying forward thrusters, one of the human officers called out, his hands moving fluidly over his console. Initiating reverse wave dispersion. The words were meaningless to Thran, but their effects weren't. On the main display, the ship's bow tilted slightly upward, its massive frame pushing into the ice field. A series of directed energy pulses rippled outward, breaking apart the surface with precision, rather than brute force. The ice crumbled into manageable fragments, forming a jagged but navigable path. Thran's lips pressed into a thin line. You're clearing a way for your ship, not my people. Blackwood's head snapped toward him, a flicker of irritation flashing across his face. Your evac shuttles can't make it to open water without this path. This isn't just about us. It's the only way they survive. Dorn stepped closer, his voice low but urgent. Commander, the station just signaled. They're loading the last group onto the shuttles, but structural integrity is failing. They need that path. Thran exhaled sharply through his nose, the sound sharp against the ambient noise of the bridge. Then clear it faster. The tension between the alien commander and the human captain lingered like static in the air, but Blackwood didn't rise to meet it. Instead, he turned back to his crew, his voice firm but composed. Increase output to 70%. Adjust for incoming debris. We're not losing anyone. The bridge responded instantly. Commands were issued, controls adjusted, and the ship moved with a deliberate grace that belied its size. Through the reinforced windows, the chaos outside was both breathtaking and terrifying. Massive sheets of ice groaned and cracked, sending up plumes of frozen mist as they collapsed into the frigid water below. The polar star pushed forward, its presence both defiant and resolute. Thran watched in silence, his mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle. The human's actions didn't align with his expectations. There was no overt manipulation, no concealed hostility, just an unrelenting drive to complete the mission. It gnawed at him, the possibility that he had misjudged them, that the answers he sought were simpler than he dared believe. Commander, Dorn said, pulling his attention back to the present. The shuttles are en route, but we've got another problem. Of course we do, Thran muttered. What now? Dorn pointed to the secondary display, where a new set of readings had appeared. Those aren't just natural fractures anymore. There's interference, seismic patterns that don't match the environment. Blackwood's head snapped up, his brows furrowing. Interference? Something else is moving beneath the ice, Dorn said. His tone was steady, but the implication hung heavy. And it's not friendly. Before anyone could respond, a deep, resonant crack echoed through the bridge, a sound that seemed to come from the very core of the planet. The lights flickered briefly, and the display screens distorted before stabilizing. Thran's stomach clenched as the ship rocked slightly, its systems compensating for the sudden shift. Report! Blackwood barked, his voice cutting through the noise. One of his officers spoke quickly, his words tumbling over one another. Seismic anomaly detected. Large mass moving toward the station's coordinates. Estimated impact in under 4 minutes. Thran turned sharply to Blackwood. Your ship. Can it intercept? The captain didn't hesitate. It'll hold the line. But if this thing breaches, your station's gone. The alien commander didn't waste time debating. He turned to Dorn, his voice as sharp as the cracking ice outside. Warn the shuttles. Tell them to change course. Use the emergency path. And the station? Dorn asked, though he already knew the answer. We'll buy them time, Thran said. His gaze returned to Blackwood, his tone cold but steady. I assume you have a plan. Blackwood's expression was grim. If it's what I think it is, we'll need every bit of power this ship has, and then some. Thran's stomach tightened, but he nodded. The stakes had shifted again, the threat evolving faster than either side could fully comprehend. Outside, the ice continued to fracture, the sound a relentless reminder of the battle they were about to face. Blackwood's voice rang out across the bridge, commanding and unyielding. All stations, brace for impact. Let's show them what this ship is built for. The Polar Star groaned under the sudden shift in pressure, its reinforced hull flexing against the forces of an unseen adversary. The temperature in the bridge seemed to drop as a new threat took form on the holographic displays. The seismic readings were no longer just fractures in the ice. They had coalesced into a distinct pattern, like a predator stalking just beneath the frozen surface. Cale Thran's sharp amber eyes flicked between the chaotic data streams and Captain Blackwood. The human captain's jaw was tight, his focus razor-sharp as he analyzed the incomprehensible patterns. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Thran demanded, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Subglacial mass," one of Blackwood's officers replied. His tone was calm, but his trembling hands betrayed him. "Larger than anticipated. Initial scans suggest movement." "Movement?" Dorn interjected, his usual flippancy replaced with disbelief. "The ice is collapsing, and now you're telling us it's alive?" "Alive or not," Blackwood said, his voice even but laced with urgency. "It's heading for the station. If we don't intercept, it's over." Thran straightened, his shoulders rigid. "What's your plan?" Blackwood turned to the central console, pulling up a detailed schematic of the icebreaker. "We've got 3 key advantages. First, the bow. It's designed to withstand extreme impacts. It'll be our battering ram. Second, the thrusters. We'll generate an opposing wave force to counteract its movement and stabilize the ice. Third," he hesitated, glancing at Thran, "we'll have to use the subsurface emitters." Thran's brow furrowed. "Emitters? You're saying this ship is armed?" "Not for combat," Blackwood clarified. "They're seismic projectors, designed to break ice layers from below to free trapped vessels. But if we amplify their output, they'll destabilize whatever's under there," Dorn finished, his tone tinged with admiration. "Clever." "It's risky," Blackwood admitted. "The stress could compromise the ship's hull. But if we don't take the shot, do it," Thran said immediately. His voice brooked no argument. "Your ship, your strategy. But if this fails, I won't hesitate to act." Blackwood gave a curt nod, his focus shifting entirely to the task at hand. "Deploy subsurface drones. We need to map its exact location before we engage." The command rippled through the bridge like a spark, igniting dry tinder. The human crew moved with synchronized precision, each action a testament to their training. On the holographic display, 6 drones detached from the icebreaker, descending into the frigid abyss with mechanical grace. Thran watched as their feeds flickered to life, illuminating the frozen underworld in hues of ghostly blue. The image on the main screen sharpened, revealing the colossal form lurking beneath the ice. It wasn't alive, not in the traditional sense, but its presence was undeniably predatory. A jagged mass of compacted ice and metal, it moved with an unnatural rhythm, propelled by forces Thran couldn't yet comprehend. "What is that?" Dorn muttered, leaning closer to the display. "Subglacial debris field," one of the human officers replied. "Looks like remnants of an old research station fused with layers of ice." "It's using the terrain," Blackwood added, his voice low but focused. "The shifting ice is amplifying its momentum." "Like a siege engine," Thran said grimly. His gaze hardened. "If it reaches the station, it won't just destroy it. It'll obliterate everything in its path." Blackwood straightened, his expression resolute. "Not if we stop it first. Helm, bring us to intercept course. Tactical, prepare the emitters. Let's make some noise." The Polar Star surged forward, its thrusters roaring as they fought against the resistant terrain. The ship carved through the fractured ice with brutal efficiency, its reinforced bow gleaming like the edge of a blade under the pale light. The vibrations grew stronger, a physical reminder of the immense forces converging beneath the surface. "Emitters online," the tactical officer reported. "Output at 70%. 70 won't cut it," Blackwood said firmly. "Push to 90. We need to destabilize it before it gains momentum." 90% risks feedback through the hull, the officer warned. "Do it," Blackwood ordered without hesitation. "We'll deal with the fallout later." Thran couldn't help but feel a flicker of respect. The human captain was decisive, unflinching in the face of risk. It was a quality Thran recognized in himself, though he'd never admit it aloud. The ship trembled as the emitters activated, sending powerful seismic waves rippling through the ice. The effect was immediate. Fissures spiderwebbed outward, disrupting the mass's trajectory. Chunks of ice erupted into the air, crashing back down with bone-jarring force. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of groaning ice and reverberating pressure. "It's working," Dorn said, his voice tinged with surprise. "You're throwing it off balance." "Not enough," Blackwood replied. His eyes were locked on the display, where the mass continued to surge forward, slower, but no less menacing. "Increase thrust. We need to hit it head-on." The Polar Star adjusted course, its bow aimed directly at the approaching threat. The ship's thrusters roared as it accelerated, cutting through the ice with relentless determination. Thran felt the weight of the moment settle over him, the realization that everything, his crew, the station, the mission, depended on this gamble. "Impact in 20 seconds, the helm officer called out. "Steady," Blackwood said, his voice calm but commanding. "Brace for collision." Thran gripped the railing as the ship surged forward, every fiber of his being coiled with anticipation. The collision came with a thunderous crash, a sound that seemed to split the world in two. The force of the impact jolted the bridge, sending crew members staggering but not falling. On the main screen, the mass shuddered, fragments breaking away as the Polar Star pressed into it. The emitters pulsed again, their seismic waves hammering the weakened structure. The debris field began to collapse, its momentum dissipating in a cascade of splintering ice and twisting metal. "Status?" Blackwood demanded, his voice sharp. "The mass is destabilizing," the tactical officer reported. "It's breaking apart." Cheers erupted across the bridge, a brief but potent release of tension, but Thran's gaze remained locked on the display, his instincts warning him that it wasn't over. And he was right. A secondary mass emerged from the fractured ice, smaller but faster, its trajectory aimed directly at the station. "Another one," Dorn said, his voice tight. "We didn't stop all of it." Blackwood's jaw clenched. "Thrusters to full. We're not done yet." Thran stepped forward, his amber eyes blazing. "If you have any other tricks, Captain, now's the time to use them." Blackwood didn't flinch. "This ship's not done fighting. Hold on." The Polar Star turned sharply, its bow carving through the chaos as it prepared for one final maneuver, and for the first time, Thran allowed himself to hope. The Polar Star surged toward the smaller mass, its reinforced bow gleaming like the tip of a spear aimed at the heart of the oncoming threat. Ice and debris cascaded around it, the fractured remnants of the larger mass falling away like ash from a dying fire. The tension in the bridge was palpable, a collective inhale that seemed to stretch time itself. "Thrusters at maximum," Blackwood barked, his voice slicing through the chaos like a whip. His eyes were locked on the display, unflinching as the smaller mass gained speed, its jagged edges cutting through the frozen landscape with deadly intent. "All emitters online. Full output. We stop it here." The ship bucked under the strain of its propulsion, the groan of metal bending to impossible forces reverberating through the air. Thran gripped the railing, his knuckles white against the dim glow of the console. He could feel the raw energy of the ship, its defiance against nature and the unknown, coursing beneath his boots, a reminder of the human's reckless audacity. "Impact in 10 seconds, the helm officer called out, his voice trembling but resolute. "Steady," Blackwood commanded, his tone unyielding. "We hit it hard. No hesitation." Thran's gaze flicked to Dorn, who stood silently beside him, his pale face reflecting the light of the tactical displays. For once, the analyst's usual smirk was absent, replaced by a quiet intensity that mirrored Thran's own. The alien commander spoke, his voice low but firm. "If this fails—" "It won't," Dorn interrupted, his tone devoid of sarcasm. "Not with them." The ship collided with the mass in a deafening explosion of ice and metal. The force of the impact sent a shudder through the polar star, the vibration resonating through every bulkhead and console. Thran staggered but held his ground. "Would you like me to continue with this thematic resolution?"